Power for the nobility is born in silk and lineage, a crown passed gently from father to son. But power from the gutter is born in hunger, in scars, in bodies sold to strangers until the soul learns that mercy is only a dream. On the day of her wedding, Constantinople glowed like fire against the sea. The domes blazed under banners of purple. The streets thundered with trumpets and chants. Inside the Hagia Sophia, Justinian, heir to the empire, placed a crown upon the head of Theodora. She had once been mocked as a spectacle, a child of the circus, a woman whose body was sold to survive. Yet now she stood as Augusta, jewels dripping light across her face, the roar of thousands breaking upon her like a tide. To the people, it was a miracle. To her, it was vindication. But the fairy tale rotted quickly. Only a few years later, the Hippodrome became a tomb. The gates were sealed, soldiers marched in, and by nightfall, 30,000 bodies lay broken upon the sand. Blood soaked into the earth where moments earlier defiance had filled the air. And it was not the emperor who commanded that fate, but the empress who had once been sold like a slave. Her rise was not a victory of love, it was a conquest of will. And in that conquest, the empire itself drowned in her shadow. Stay until the end, and subscribe, because the reign of Theodora is not a story of silk and crowns, but of how power from the dirt can stain the world in blood. Theodora's story does not begin with marble columns or jeweled halls. It begins in the dirt of the circus. She was born around the year 500 in Constantinople, the daughter of a man who worked as a bearkeeper for the city's Hippodrome. His name was Acacius, and his job was to tame and parade the animals that thrilled the crowds. When he died unexpectedly, the family was left with nothing. Theodora's mother, desperate to survive, pushed her children toward the stage, for the theater and the circus were the only doors still open to the poor. Theodora was still a child when she stepped into that world. The stage was no place of magic for her. It was a cage lit by torches, a place where the crowd came not to admire, but to laugh, to jeer, to strip her of dignity before she could even understand what dignity meant. She danced. She performed tricks. She was forced to entertain men who saw her not as a girl, but as a spectacle. Laughter followed her steps, sharp as knives. At night, the performance did not end. Behind the curtains and in the shadows of taverns, her body was treated as another coin to be spent. The streets of Constantinople could be merciless, and for Theodora, childhood was a slow education in cruelty. Yet even within this degradation, there was a strange fire. Observers later described her as clever, quick, impossible to ignore. She learned to read faces, to twist an insult into an opportunity, to survive with wit as much as with her body. In the gutter, she developed the resilience of someone who had already lost everything. Theodora was marked by hunger and humiliation, but she refused to break beneath them. In these years, the line between child and woman blurred too quickly. What should have been innocence became survival. What should have been laughter became scars. And yet, through the pain, an idea lingered in the shadows of her mind. She was not like the others who bowed their heads and accepted their place. She was not ordinary. She was born not to serve, but to be swallowed by the throne. This belief, impossible and defiant, became her armor. It did not erase the misery, but it gave her a direction. As Constantinople moved around her in splendor and corruption, Theodora carried within herself the seed of something no one expected. In a world that tried to bury her in shame, she was already preparing to rise. By the time her name began to circulate in the city's whispers, Theodora was no longer the shadow of a child humiliated before crowds. She had grown into a woman whose presence unsettled everyone around her. The sharpness of her mind, the calm in her bearing, and the way she seemed to reject the limits imposed on her set her apart. She was not an ornament, nor a courtesan content to linger on the margins. She carried an intensity that made people look twice, even when they wished to look away. It was this quality that captured the attention of Justinian, nephew to Emperor Justin. He was a man consumed by vision. He studied law until every clause bent to his will, and he devoured theology as if even faith could be drafted into his service. Yet behind his brilliance was solitude. The palace walls granted him authority, but they also closed him in. When he met Theodora, he encountered something entirely new. She spoke with wit that cut through the honeyed words of courtiers, and her gaze held steady as though nothing could shake her. In her, Justinian did not see scandal. He saw strength. Their bond grew quickly, and with it the unease of the empire. For generations, Byzantine law had forbidden men of rank from marrying actresses or courtesans. Such women were branded impure, forever unworthy of sharing the dignity of nobility. Advisors pleaded with Justinian to let the relationship fade into silence. Bishops muttered that a woman of sin could never be crowned with sacred authority. Even foreign envoys sneered, mocking Byzantium for daring to consider her as empress. But Justinian was not a man to bow to tradition when it blocked his will. He had the law itself rewritten, abolishing the statute that forbade noblemen from marrying women of the stage. It was not only an act of devotion, but a declaration that the empire would bend to his command. In 525, Justinian married Theodora. The union scandalized the court, but it could not be undone. When Justin I died 2 years later, Justinian ascended the throne, and Theodora was crowned Augusta beside him. Beneath the golden dome of the Hagia Sophia, with incense thick in the air and choirs filling the cavernous space, she stood robed in imperial purple. Jewels blazed across her face as she lifted her chin to the roar of the crowd. It was the culmination of a rise no one could have imagined. The woman once dismissed in whispers now stood at the very heart of empire. Yet even in triumph, shadows gathered. Courtiers bent in deep bows, but their eyes revealed disdain. Priests raised their voices in blessings, but their lips curled as they spoke. For many, she would never escape the brand of her origins. Every decree she signed, every word she spoke in council, was measured against the memory of who she had been. Theodora knew this well. Her crown glittered, but its weight was carved from scorn. She had reached the height of power, but she stood on a foundation of hostility. To maintain her place, she would need more than the emperor's love. She would need to wield power with a ferocity that silenced every whisper. Thus her rise, dazzling as it appeared, carried the seed of tragedy. Love had lifted her to the throne, but hatred closed in on all sides. In the years to come, that hatred would demand a reckoning, one that would stain the very sand of Constantinople. Theodora did not take her crown to stand silently in ceremonies. Once Augusta, she stepped into the councils of empire with a steadiness that startled even her husband's most seasoned advisors. She spoke when few expected her to, and what she said carried weight. Her presence was not decorative, it was commanding. In those early years, her hand could be felt most strongly in laws that touched the forgotten corners of society. She pressed Justinian to act against the exploitation of women, to give them protection where once there had been only indifference. Brothels that had long been traps were suddenly subject to regulation. Girls abandoned to poverty were offered a way out. Slaves sold like objects found in her an unlikely defender. Theodora did not erase suffering, but she forced the empire to look at those it had chosen to ignore. Yet every step she took into power drew a sharper circle of isolation. In the great halls where marble walls magnified every sound, courtiers bowed low, but their voices shifted to whispers as soon as she passed. She could feel their eyes trace her movements, not with reverence but with disdain. They saw her not as a reformer, not even as an empress, but as a courtesan dressed in purple silk. Every decree she touched became for them a scandal, proof that a crown had been placed upon the wrong head. Behind closed doors they gathered, speaking in voices low and careful. Plots were not open. They were subtle, born of contempt rather than courage. She was present in the council, but she was never among them. They listened to her words with straight faces, yet in the silence that followed she could almost hear the scrape of knives being sharpened elsewhere. Beyond the palace, the judgment was just as heavy. Priests raised their eyes to heaven and let their sermons fall like veiled accusations. The people of Constantinople heard those words echo in the vast churches, and when the bells tolled, the sound lingered like a verdict. For Theodora, those bells were not a call to prayer, but an indictment, a reminder that her past would never be forgiven. It was as though the city itself spoke against her, not through shouts or protests, but through silence and sound that carried no name. Still, she refused to retreat. Theodora sat beside Justinian in council, not as a shadow, but as an equal. He leaned toward her when she spoke, and his trust enraged those who wanted her voiceless. With her influence, the empire's laws shifted, and with each shift the contempt of her enemies grew deeper. The more she gave voice to the powerless, the more the powerful worked to erase her. Her reign became a paradox of light and shadow. She gave compassion where none had been offered, yet received none herself. She stretched out her hand to protect the vulnerable, yet walked daily through corridors filled with scorn. The bells of the city kept ringing, steady, inevitable, like the heartbeat of judgment. And so she moved through those years of triumph, wrapped in a kind of solitude. Theodora had seized power with a ferocity no one could deny, but the price of holding it was to live surrounded by eyes that never looked at her with love, only with suspicion. In the empire's records, her reforms changed lives. In the palace, she remained an outsider, ruling from the center yet never belonging there. The year was 532, and Constantinople trembled. What began as anger over chariot races and political rivalries swelled into something far more dangerous. Crowds poured into the streets, their chants rising like thunder against the palace. The Hippodrome became the beating heart of the revolt, packed with 30,000 voices shouting for justice, for blood, for change. Smoke curled above the city, flames licked at the roofs, and the empire itself seemed ready to collapse. Inside the palace, fear spread like fire. Advisors rushed to Justinian, urging him to abandon the capital. Carriages were prepared, ships readied in the harbor. The emperor, shaken by the roar of rebellion, leaned toward flight. His face, once calm with certainty, now carried the pale mask of doubt. It seemed the throne of Byzantium, so carefully built, would be left behind to the fury of its people. Then Theodora rose. She did not tremble. She did not soften her words. Her voice cut through the chamber with a cold clarity that silenced every whisper. She told them that those who had worn the crown should not live to see themselves stripped of it. "Royalty is a fine burial shroud," she said, her eyes steady, her tone unyielding. "Death in dignity," she declared, "was better than life in disgrace." The room stilled. Even Justinian, shaken as he was, could not ignore her defiance. In that moment, the course of the empire shifted, not by the will of its emperor, but by the resolve of its empress. The order was given. Soldiers marched into the Hippodrome, their armor gleaming under a sky choked with smoke. The gates were sealed shut. What had been a stadium of voices became a cage. Then steel met flesh. The sound was deafening screams that pierced the air, swords clashing, the trampling of boots across sand already stained red. Men begged for mercy. Women clutched their children. Bodies collided in panic as the army cut its way through the mass. The sand grew darker with every stroke of the blade, with every spear driven into the crowd. Blood pooled at the feet of the soldiers, rising until the Hippodrome itself seemed to drown in it. By nightfall, silence fell over the arena. The cries had vanished, the chants extinguished. 30,000 corpses lay sprawled where moments before they had shouted in defiance. The smell of iron and smoke hung heavy in the air, a shroud over the city's heart. It was not Justinian's hesitation that saved the throne, nor his strategy. It was Theodora's unflinching command that turned revolt into massacre. With her words, the empire had chosen blood over surrender. The Hippodrome, once the pride of Constantinople, had become its grave. And as the fires died down and the city lay quiet, Byzantium remained under imperial rule, but at a price that would haunt its stones for centuries. The streets no longer echoed with rebellion, yet beneath them the memory of that day lingered. It was not the emperor's courage that held the empire together. It was the empress, a woman who had clawed her way from humiliation to power, and who had decided that 30,000 lives were not too high a cost to preserve her crown. She sat alone in her chamber, a piece of fabric stretched across her lap, the golden thread glinting faintly in the light of the oil lamps. Her fingers, once steady and precise, trembled as they tried to guide the needle through the cloth. For a moment, the silence seemed almost peaceful. The empress bent over something as ordinary as embroidery. Then the needle slipped. It clattered softly against the marble floor. Theodora stared at her hand, at the slight trembling she could not control. Power had made her untouchable in the council halls, but here, in the quiet of her chamber, her body betrayed her. After the revolt, her authority had reached its peak. She was no longer questioned in council. Her voice carried the weight of inevitability. Her word could alter the empire's course. Yet while the world bent to her will, her own flesh began to turn against her. Illness came first as fatigue, dismissed at the start, then as pain that could no longer be ignored. Physicians spoke in hushed tones. The empire would not know the name of her enemy until centuries later: cancer. Theodora wasted away slowly. Her once radiant presence diminished into thinness, her body folding into itself as though retreating from life. Nights stretched into torment. Fever shook her. Dreams twisted into delirium. Whispers of judgment echoing in her mind. She who had once commanded the massacre of 30,000 now fought silently with an invisible adversary, powerless to halt its spread. Justinian remained at her side. He was emperor of a realm that stretched from North Africa to the gates of Persia, Yet in the shadow of her illness, he was only a husband, helpless, watching the woman who had shaped his reign fade before him. Courtiers passed through the palace with softer steps. Bells from the great churches tolled in the distance, their sound heavy, as though the city itself anticipated her end. In the long corridors, officials and servants whispered. To some, her decline was a judgment finally delivered. To others, it was the silencing of a force that had redefined power in Byzantium. But within the private rooms of the palace, she was not Augusta or Empress, not the woman who had defied priests and defied mobs. She was simply Theodora, fragile, wrapped in heavy blankets, her breath shallow in the darkness. The end came in the year 548. No procession, no great proclamation announced it. Her death was quiet, cold, without words. One evening she was still present, diminished but breathing. By morning, the palace woke to silence. Theodora was gone, only 48 years old. The woman who had risen from the gutter to command an empire now lay lifeless, leaving Justinian to reign without her voice. Her body was laid to rest in Constantinople, in the great church of the Holy Apostles. The city that had once screamed under her command now mourned in uneasy quiet. For some, her passing was a relief, the closing of a chapter they had never accepted. For others, it was the loss of the only ruler who had dared to see those forgotten by power. In the end, it was not the roar of crowds or the clash of armies that ended her reign, but the quiet betrayal of her own flesh. Theodora had outlasted scandal, revolt, and hatred, but no crown, no law, no voice could stand against the slow erosion of disease. The woman who had carved her name in blood and reform slipped away into silence, leaving behind a throne that would never feel the same without her. When news of her death spread through the palace, Justinian wept. To him, she had been more than an empress, more than a partner in rule. She was the voice that steadied him, the iron that kept him from crumbling when the weight of empire pressed too heavily. But as his grief unfolded, the mood around him shifted in another direction. Many courtiers exhaled as though a storm had passed. For them, Theodora had been a disturber of order, a constant challenge to the traditions they clung to. With her gone, they believed the palace would return to its familiar rhythm. History, however, has never spoken with one voice about Theodora. To some, she remains the woman who reshaped laws to protect the vulnerable, who reached into the shadows of Constantinople to give dignity to those the empire had abandoned. To others, she is forever bound to the massacre of the Nika Revolt, remembered less as a reformer than as the empress whose words condemned 30,000 to die. Even in death, she was caught between reverence and revulsion. The symbols of her life endure like shadows etched into the city itself. The Hippodrome still stood, its track covered with fresh sand, its seats filled once again with spectators. Yet beneath that sand lingered the memory of the day it became a grave. 30,000 voices silenced under a rain of swords. No matter how brightly the games returned, the earth carried blood that could not be erased. The palace, too, remained radiant, its mosaics glittering in candlelight, its halls humming with politics and ceremony. But without Theodora, something essential was missing. The corridors felt hollow, stripped of the sharp presence that had once cut through their silence. Power remained, but the woman who had wielded it with such defiance was gone, leaving only an emptiness that no jewel or chant could fill. Her story resists conclusion. Was she a savior, or was she a tyrant? Was she a voice of justice or a hand of cruelty? The truth may be that she was all of these at once, a woman too fierce to be reduced to a single image. If a girl once sold as nothing could rise to rule an empire and turn its capital into a river of blood, then how many other truths lie buried beneath the stories we are told? Stay with us, because this channel is where we dig into the past, uncover the lives hidden behind legend, and give shape to the shadows that history tried to bury. Like, share, and subscribe, because Theodora's reign is only one of many tales the world has tried to forget. And together, we will bring them back into the light.